North Carolina people, conversations with interesting Tar Heels from across the state. Today's guests are Mr. Myrick Howard, Executive Director, and Mr. James A. Gray, Director of Development of the Historic Preservation Fund of North Carolina. Talking with Mr. Howard and Mr. Gray is William C. Friday, President of the University of North Carolina.
Well, gentlemen, it's good to have you come on, North Carolina people, and both of you are involved in what I think is one of the most sensitive, interesting, and probably most active subjects in the state, historic preservation. Jim, how did this fund get started?
Well, we were brought into being back in 1975 by the Historic Preservation Society of North Carolina, which is a membership organization. They wanted to start a revolving fund to actually save endangered buildings. And rather than do that within the society, they formed a separate nonprofit corporation, namely ourselves, to operate this revolving fund. So that this is what we do. We identify and try to take off the market, so to speak, noteworthy endangered historic structures, and then place them in the hands of people who will agree to restore them and preserve them.
Myrick, why so much of this activity right now? Every time you turn around, you know, see something in the paper about what you're doing or archives and history. What's prompted all this?
Well, I think there are two principal components behind this. For one thing, the economy. New construction costs are going very high now, and people are beginning to realize that rehabilitation can be a viable alternative to new construction. And I think a lot of people are also dissatisfied with the quality of new construction as well. Now, the second thing, I think a lot of people have been very disenchanted with what happened during the last 20 years in the name of progress. A lot of things were torn down that people really cared about, and they're interested now in preserving more than just the one house museum for the town. They're interested in preserving their hotel or their railroad station or a neighborhood. And I think that's a trend that we're going to see more and more of as the economy goes in the direction that it's going.
When I was in my hometown of Dallas in Gaston County recently, I saw that Jim had literally picked up the little depot and carried it up to another part of the town along with one caboose and turned it into an art museum, a library facility. Right. And is this what happens around the countryside?
Well, there are groups, very active groups in a number of North Carolina communities and all over the United States. And wherever we find a community that has an organization already formed, we perceive our role to be that of giving advice and encouragement to that local group. But then that leaves us vast areas of North Carolina, the forgotten areas, so to speak, where there's very little money, very little interest in historic preservation, very little preservation activity, but a number of noteworthy buildings that need to be saved. So we step into that vacuum in a situation like that.
Well, now before we ask our director to throw those slides up on the screen that you brought with you, I'd like to ask you, as each one comes up, tell us why this particular facility has been saved under your fund principles and what it has to say to communities that might not be in preservation work right now. So let's look at the first one.
All right. Well, this is the Bingham House, very near Chapel Hill, built in 1846. We became involved in this because the owners had decided to sell it but didn't know how to go about it, so to speak. They did not know how to impose the necessary restrictive covenants in the deed to whomever bought it. So we obtained an option on it. We bought it and we resold it to Mr. and Ms. Randolph Horner, who are now restoring it under protective covenants and under our general supervision.
Jim, was this the site of the famous Bingham School?
Yes, it was. The Bingham School moved around. It was in Mebane for a while, it was in Hillsborough for a while, but it was also located here in Orange County for a while.
All right, well, let's look at the next one then.
And this is the Griffin house in Little Washington, built in the early 1800s, one of the oldest structures in Little Washington, which was in danger of being demolished. But we prevailed upon the property owner to sell us about a 2.5 months option to see if we could find someone who would be willing to restore this building, and we were able to locate Mr. Hugh Todd of Rocky Mount, who bought it through us and who is restoring it. And this next slide shows the same house as it is being restored, and the next slide is that of a very attractive and important outbuilding behind the house that was almost completely covered with vines at the time that we entered the picture.
Now, looking at that particular structure, have you been able to authenticate the work that you're doing through historical records that were available to you about the structure as the pattern of rebuilding it in the correct way, or just following a pattern of the Revolutionary period, or what do you do?
Well, we of course searched the courthouse records. We and also the State Division of Archives and History searched the documentary evidence on this building, and also architectural historians examined the building in comparison with other buildings in Little Washington, and were able to determine its approximate age and what was original, what had been added, and what needed to be done to restore the house properly.
Well, let's look at the next one then.
This is the Bartlett Yancey house in Caswell County near Yanceyville. This front portion was built about 1856. The next slide shows the earlier federal cottage behind, which was built about 1810. This was a very important structure that had not been occupied since 1955, if you can imagine, and had suffered from vandalism and the weather and so forth. It was built by an important North Carolinian who was a United States congressman who served for 10 consecutive terms as president of the North Carolina State Senate, and his home was going to rack and ruin. And we were able to get an option on this property, find a buyer, and this house is now being restored as a private residence by a couple from New York City. And this is the Jessie Clement house in Mocksville, built about 1815, which has been purchased by a Presbyterian minister and his wife from Hamlet, North Carolina, Dr. and Mrs. William Long, and they're going to restore it as their retirement home. And this is the Harper house in Randolph County, which is being restored by a furniture designer as his showroom and studio.
How did you come upon this particular, to use that form of expression, this particular structure, and get notice about it and then get active?
Well, this is an interesting situation in that the property owner called us and said he thought he had a very old house. It might be too much for him to restore. This was a young bachelor. And we went down and looked at it. I took my assistant at the time, an architectural historian, with me, and she confirmed the house, the fact that this was a very historic house, built by a very important person at a very early date for Randolph County. And we negotiated with the property owner, who decided that yes, he did want to sell it. He wanted to sell it through us. And we purchased the house and sold it to someone who has the means and the desire to restore it and preserve it correctly.
Myrick, would each of these properties be in some way identified with archives and history in Raleigh, and what is the connection here between what Jim has been saying and what goes on there?
Okay, the Division of Archives and History is, of course, part of the state government, and we are a private corporation. We have a really good working relationship with the division. They will provide information to us about houses that are endangered around the state, and then they will do a considerable amount of the research on the house, sometimes before we become involved and sometimes after we become involved. They will help us out with providing architects, architectural historians, historians to write up the information about the house, and we just have a very good cooperative arrangement with the division. We also get some money from the federal government through the Division of Archives and History in a quite innovative cooperative agreement that we have there, where the money comes to us when we purchase a property, and then we turn around and give a good portion of that money right back to them to be reused a second time. So federal money is being used twice for preservation in the state. And the Department of the Interior has given a great deal of recognition to this as being one of the best and innovative use of federal funds in the country.
Well, let's go back to the slides, Jim. What's next here?
This next one is Myrick Howard's slide.
This is the Havens Warehouse down in Washington, North Carolina. It was a shipping warehouse for the Pamlico River shipping industry that developed down in Little Washington in the early 19th century. The building was donated to the fund by John Havens Moss, who was a direct descendant of the builder, Jonathan Havens. The building apparently was built around 1817, and we have sold the property to a person that is going to develop it for a restaurant. So it'll be down on the water, and there'll be marina facilities, and boats will once again come to Havens Warehouse.
Well, now this is the first slide showing a commercial property that you're preserving. The others were residential. This is possible too, then?
Right, and we're very interested in the commercial properties as well. We have tended to stick with the rural areas since they are the ones in greatest need, and some of the small towns we are also working with property owners there when we become aware of a commercial structure that is going to be demolished. That certainly is one of the earliest commercial structures in the state.
Are there other slides, Jim?
Yes.
Oh, here we go.
Okay, this is Ivy Hill in Halifax County. We worked with the state on this one. This was originally given to the state of North Carolina with the idea that would become either a state historic site or part of Medoc Mountain State Park, which is right across the road from the house. It's got exceptional interiors in it. This is in the newer part of the house, built around 1847, and it's the wood along the baseboard, which was painted to look like marble, and it's in beautiful condition. And in the older part of the house, built around 1800, is very fine Georgian woodwork, which has lasted close to 200 years without ever being painted. The house had no kitchens, no bathrooms, had not been occupied at all for nearly 10 years, and then prior to that it hadn't been occupied during a winter for nearly 50 years prior to that. So you can imagine the condition of it. Then in Warrenton, right outside of town, there was the Shady Oaks, which was kind of a plain-looking house from the outside, very fancy interior woodwork, as the next shot will show. This house was being used by its owner to store tobacco in when we first got involved with it. He had been renting it, and he loved the house dearly, but he couldn't afford to fix it up to rent it. And so we got an option on it, and a couple from the canal zone came up to look at it and are buying it and plan to restore it and retire to the town of Warrenton when they reach retirement age. This is the Capehart House in Raleigh, and it's owned by the state government, and this is before any work was done on it. The Capehart House was in a precarious position because it was in the middle of the new state government mall, and the plans had been to move the house several years ago into a different neighborhood where it would be more appropriately sited. And this is a photograph of it after it had been turned around. It's up on wheels.
There it is en route.
That's right. It's 5,500 square feet of brick house and slate roof. This one was almost like a melodrama because it was the last week of December that the Advisory Budget Commission of the state decided that they could not afford to expend all of the money to move the house. And yet there was a grant available that had to be committed before January 1. So on approximately December 30th, we agreed to put up $50,000 to help move this house. We will get that money back in the form of rent during the first couple of years of use of this building as an office building. It's quite an exceptional house, and ironically, this was built by the daughter of the owner of Ivy Hill. So we're getting family connections going as well.
This one?
This is Ravenscroft in Asheville, built in the mid-1840s. It's probably the oldest structure still standing in downtown Asheville. Built originally as a private residence, it was enlarged and adapted for use as a school for boys by the Episcopal Church, who named their school after Bishop John Stark Ravenscroft, the first Episcopal bishop in North Carolina. We have an option on this property. We have it up for sale, and we're presently looking for a buyer who will agree to restore and preserve Ravenscroft.
One thing I'd like to point out is that there are some very good tax incentives for undertaking a project such as this if you're dealing with a building that's going to be income producing, either used for commercial use or rental use. Under federal law, you can take depreciation very quickly on the property, and this makes a property such as Ravenscroft a very good buy for a buyer who's interested in converting it to something like offices. We've had, I guess, 4 out of our 9 properties have been, we call it tax reform acted. They have been rehabilitated under the Tax Reform Act provisions.
But another way of saying what you just said is that every one of these properties that you've talked about has activity about it. They're not museum pieces. Now, is that the modern day thinking about preservation?
That's the new look in historic preservation, known as adaptive reuse, which means no more museums. It's not possible. There's not enough tax money and or charitable money to save all of the noteworthy historic buildings in this country. And the only way that you can save them is to attract private investment into these properties, and private investment will only go into it if they can adapt the building for residential use, offices, restaurant use, retail space, or whatever. But the important thing is for the building to be saved rather than be plowed under.
Well, actually, Jim, don't the engineers and architects tell you that it's better that it be used and just have it standing there, even in a restored state?
Oh, yeah.
It makes so much difference to the...
More activity, the better.
Well, now, as I've talked with you before we started filming this program, we know about what happens in cities like Wilmington and Raleigh and Charlotte and Asheville, but the smaller community now, how can you help me? I'm watching and listening to what you say, and I'm interested in saving some properties that I know are built in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. What do I do first?
Well, I would suggest that you contact State Archives and History first and get a professional judgment on how significant your structure is or your area is, and this is part of their business. And then if they say that what you have is certainly worth saving and you feel that it's a job for private investment, but you don't know exactly how to merchandise your property and put the restrictive covenants in the deed and so forth, then either contact us direct or suggest to the State Division of Archives and History that they contact us, and we'll be glad to talk with you as a community leader or as an individual property owner and explore the possibilities of how we might be able to merchandise your property in the way that you want it merchandised, and in order to save it, preserve it.
Several times you've used the words restrictive covenants. Now, I'm hearing you, and I just saw that last slide, and you looking for a buyer at Ravenscroft in Asheville. What does that suggest to me? What are you going to say to me that I must sign before you'd sell me that property?
Well, Myrick is an attorney, I'm not, and I'll let him answer that question.
Thanks. Principally, we're talking about no demolition, alteration, or new construction without our approval. It's not that we don't like new construction, we would just like to see it done right if new construction is put onto the site as a component of the old house. We do put some restrictions in on the time that people have to restore the property. We try to work with the individual property owners on this. Normally we require that the property be restored within 3 years of its purchase. We sometimes include a public access requirement. On some of our properties, they have to be open to the public 4 days out of the year. And surprisingly, we're finding a lot of the people that are buying them for residential purposes are delighted with that. I usually think that that's going to be like pulling teeth to get someone to open their house 4 days a year, but most people say, I'd love to have the opportunity to do it. On all of our properties, we require that public be able to walk around them, look at the exterior at least 12 days a year, and with most of our properties, that's no imposition at all. But our principal concern is just no demolition, and we don't want to see them altered in an inappropriate way. We realize that changes do have to be made, but we would like to see them done well.
And one other thing that we put in this deed and option agreement, that's the title of it, and it's filed with the Register of Deeds along with all the other deeds. But this is something that we've copied from Old Salem. You should have some sort of a penalty, of course, in the event that a person violates the covenants in the deed. About our only penalty, and the only practical penalty that you can put in there, is for us to reserve for ourselves the right to repurchase that property, retain an option to repurchase that property under several different conditions. In other words, we don't want to repossess properties once we sell them, but we wouldn't hesitate one moment to step in and repossess a property if the property owner failed to perform the way he said he was going to perform. So that's the penalty that we hold over his head, so to speak. He could lose his property.
Jim, you mentioned Old Salem. Of course, that's one of the splendid examples of what can happen in an organized effort, authenticated historically and so on. Are there other places in the state where that kind of detail has been followed?
Well, there are other places where that quality of detail has certainly, and authenticity has been followed, such as at Tryon Palace and a number of the state historic sites. I think Old Salem is perhaps the only museum town, if you please, an entire 18th century town that has been restored, like Williamsburg, for instance. But there's other very fine, very authentic restoration work taking place in North Carolina.
Hearing you talk, this question obviously comes along 100 years from now when those citizens look back at us and our generation. What are we doing to save what we're building and doing that might be of some value as an example of our own civilization at this time in world history? What should we be doing?
Well, there is some very good new construction taking place in North Carolina today. We should be very concerned with the appearance of our communities, and I think that'll go a long way. Encouraging new construction, encouraging contemporary design versus traditional design. A lot of people think just because we like old houses, we want all the houses to look old, and that's not necessarily the case. We like to see some new designs, that will show our generation was innovative and creating new appearances as well. This move in preservation's gone a long way. I would say 5 or 10 years ago, there would have been a lot of concern for things built before 1830, and that's about it. And then it got up to antebellum, and now it's into Victorian, and some neighborhoods in North Carolina now that were built in the 19-teens and 1920s are becoming objects of a great deal of interest. And I think that people that are concerned with preservation have to be concerned with the total built environment, including what's built in the 1970s, to make sure that future preservationists have something worth preserving that was built during our own generation.
I'm an interested citizen, and I've listened to you through this program, and I think I know where there's a facility that someone should look at. What should I do? Write to you, Jim?
Well, we have two offices. Should explain that Myrick, as executive director, has an office in Raleigh and is looking after the eastern half of the state, so to speak. And I, as director of development, have an office in Asheville, and I'm looking after the western part of the state. So, and we're in close communication with one another by correspondence, by telephone. We're here together today. You could contact either one of us, but if your property, your problem happened to be in the eastern part of the state, Myrick would probably look after it. If it's in the western part of the state, I would probably look after it. And I might just say, at this point, we were talking about the close cooperation between the State Division of Archives and History and ourselves. Archives and History is providing me with free office space in their suite of offices there in Asheville. Mm-hmm. So that they must think I'm contributing something towards what they're working on. And we lean on each other.
Do you have a list that you're looking ahead on? Already identified projects?
We have a list.
I hate to say the endangered properties list in North Carolina right now is about 4 pages single-spaced.
Does that mean you fear things like highway development?
Largely, our concern more than anything else ends up being what's called rural rot. The buildings that are just vacant and subject to vandalism and bad weather, and they'll tear up a building just as quickly as a bulldozer.
That's right.
Is that widespread in the state, that
Yes.
kind of neglect?
Yes, it is.
So what you're interested in is a local group that bands together and then comes to you as a nucleus force that's going to work for this kind of preservation then.
Mm-hmm.
If this important structure you see is in a major city, like Charlotte, Winston-Salem, Greensboro, Raleigh, or whatever,
Jim, I'm sorry. We've run out of time. I wish I could have gotten that answer in, but thank you for coming on North Carolina.
they'll look
People.
after it.
We'll see if they get to you, and thank you for being on our program.
Well, thank you.
Dr. William Friday, president of the University of North Carolina, talking with Myrick Howard and James A. Gray of the Historic Preservation Fund of North Carolina. This has been North Carolina People, conversations with interesting Tar Heels from across the state. This program was produced by the University of North Carolina Television Network in Chapel Hill.